Good afternoon. This is Sarah Mancall. I'm the Policy Director here at the Society for the Psychological Study of Social Issues. We're also known as Division 9 of the American Psychological Association. And thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar. It's on training psychology graduate students to prepare psychological affidavits for asylum seekers. And a little bit about today's webinar presenters. Dr. Carl Auerbach is a professor at the Virchow Graduate School of Psychology at Yeshiva University. He has done extensive research on the psychology of collective trauma and was the recipient of a Fulbright Fellowship to teach and do research at the National University of Rwanda. Dr. William Salton is also a clinical professor at the Virchow, where he runs the program's training clinic. He also has a private practice in Manhattan and works primarily with trauma survivors. And a little bit about today's webinar organizers. This webinar is the second in a springtime series that we're going to be hosting over the course of 2019 into the summer and fall. It's being sponsored by the APA CODAPAR funded grant on immigrant and refugee advocacy. The project is being spearheaded by APA Division 24 in collaboration with many other APA divisions, including 5, 9, 27, 32, 37, 39, 45, 48, 52, and 56. After this webinar, you can find the webinar video archived on SPICY's YouTube page. And we're going to have about 45 minutes for presentations and then the last 15 minutes for Q&A. So if you do have questions for the presenters, please type them into the chat box and we'll try to get to as many questions as we can. And with that, I would like to turn it over to our presenters for today.
Okay, so this is Bill Salton speaking. First of all, thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I can't see you, but I know you're there. And I'm going to be speaking first, and then Carl is going to be speaking. To start this webinar, I'm going to be telling you sort of a cross between a story and a how-to manual, a story of the Asylum program that Carl and I started about 5 years ago at Virchow. And also a sort of a how-to of how to possibly start a program like this yourself if you're in graduate education, or if you're not, just how to do asylum interviews in the way that we do them, and try to not fall into some of the pitfalls that we fell into. So our setting is we're a graduate program. We have we're one psychology graduate school with 4 programs. We are a clinical adult program, a PsyD program, a child PsyD program, a health PhD program, and a licensed mental health counseling program. And all of them can learn how to evaluate asylum seekers in the class that Carl and I started. And it's not just a class, it's a practical training, because as you heard Sarah say, I run the training clinic here at Virchow. And so in the last part of our class, the second half of our class, we invite asylum seekers to come and be interviewed as part of our training clinic. And we write their affidavits. I'll talk more about that later. Another plus that we have in setting up our training program is we have access to other university departments at Yeshiva. Yeshiva has a law school, the Cardozo Law School, and one of our triumphs is that we were able to work with the law students to provide the legal aspect of the asylum seeker's affidavit, and we provide the psychological, psychiatric aspect. And so we've worked together. We like to call ourselves a pan-yeshiva program. And of course, another setting, another asset is New York City, where we're located. There are many, many organizations in New York that help asylum seekers. PHR, Physicians for Human Rights, which I'll talk about in a moment. Finding the Road, many of these places you've heard of, and we work with them. There are also many law firms besides Cardozo that help asylum seekers. There are two types of law firms. Some are immigration law firms, and others are, shall we say, white shoe law firms that do public service work in helping asylum seekers. And we've worked with both of those law firms. Okay, next slide, Carl, please.
Yeah.
So let me give you the history of this program, how it started very briefly. We had an adjunct supervisor in the clinic named Barbara Isold, who was doing asylum work, and I knew her just as a supervisor in the clinic. And one day she said to me, "So Bill, you should do asylum work." And I knew nothing about this. I thought she was talking about insane asylums. I thought we keep people out of insane asylums. But I quickly learned that she was talking about political asylum, and she connected me with Physicians for Human Rights, and she also connected me with some of our law school faculty who were doing this. And I quickly got Carl, who is our trauma expert on the faculty here, and we decided, yes, we would like to set up a program to do this. And so we engaged in a see one, do one, teach one. We watched Barbara do a number of asylum programs, and then we joined PHR and were trained ourselves in how to do asylum. Physicians for Human Rights runs a number of training sessions all around the country for people who want to learn how to do asylum evaluations, and we did that. And then we thought, okay, let's set up our training program. And for those of you out there who know about university politics, you can only imagine that we had administrative and legal hassles to do because, you know, setting up an asylum program here meant change, and it meant something new. And organizations and systems really need to be tweaked and prodded and pushed to do things new and to institute changes. But so it took about a year and a half to get through all of the hassles that we needed to get through. But indeed, Carl and I prevailed with legal and administrative. And so we started our asylum program, which means that we set up a class to teach students how to evaluate asylum seekers. And now I'll tell you a little about the class. Next slide, please, Carl. So the class runs every semester, and the class can take no more than 8 students. It meets for 2 hours a week. Carl and I are the 2 instructors. And really, when we started, it's like, okay, we're going to try and do this. And over the last 5 years, we've learned through trial and error how to really make a very efficient program of training students to evaluate asylum seekers and write affidavits. And we also train them about immigration and legal issues. And so I'll tell you about that now. Next slide, please. So let me tell you about our training. We start every class with the questions of who we are and why we're here. Because asylum work, we found that you cannot do asylum work without knowing your own cultural history, your own immigration history, and really why you're doing this. What's motivating you to do this? Because it not everyone in our graduate school is interested in this, and so usually we find that our students have their own immigration history, their own immigration ghosts. My parents were Holocaust survivors, and I'm a first generation, and I speak about that, and certainly that's part of my, as they say on the street, my Jones to do this. And then we show the film Well-Founded Fear over 2 classes. And this is a film which was actually made in the late 90s, but it's available on YouTube and it can be bought on Amazon. And it really does a wonderful job of focusing both on the asylum seekers and the immigration workers from the Department of Homeland Security who evaluate them. And it speaks, the movie doesn't talk about this, but it really speaks a lot about the relationship between an asylum evaluator and the evaluatee, almost transference and countertransference. Of course, it doesn't speak about that. And we spent a lot of time discussing this movie. And then we start and that's a very good basis of immigration and starting to get people to think about immigration and what immigration issues are. And then we teach them how to do psychological interviews for writing the affidavits, and I'll speak more about that in a moment. And then we have someone from Cardozo come in and present on the legal aspects of asylum, what asylum means in court, in case history, etc. And that takes up the first half of every semester, sort of providing the theory, providing the techniques of doing the interview. And then in part two, next slide, please. In part two, we interview 4 asylum seekers. During the first half of the semester, we have brought them in from various referral sources that we've built over the years. And so what happens is that of our 8 students, we have 4 student teams to interview the asylum seeker. As a matter of fact, we start to call them teams. Team Honduras, Team Guatemala, Team Nigeria, Team wherever the person is from. And there is a transcriber in the room with the team. And Carl and I and the rest of the students sit in another room observing the interview and monitoring it with a baby monitor. And we text back and forth with the students to sort of guide the interview. You can see we're extremely high-tech here, text and baby monitors, but it works. Everyone in the class observes all the interviews, and after the interview, we always process the interview with the class. What was said, what feelings it brought up, how we're going to write up the affidavit. And we also preview every interview before we do it, what we're going to ask, what it means, what they've gone through. And it's very important that the students do the mechanics of each evaluation. They work with the lawyers, they work with the translators, and they really learn everything hands-on. And Carl and I, of course, oversee the entire process. And we learn from our mistakes. For a while, we started to do these interviews in the room with the students, and we found that didn't work because Carl and I, of course, have done this more, and we ended up taking over the interview, and that was hardly a good teaching process. Also, we learned about defenses. There are many asylum seekers who want to present just fine and act as if they're just fine. And of course, that's been an adaptive procedure throughout their immigration experience. But we have learned to find ways to cut through their defenses and figure out what is the matter, what psychiatric diagnosis is the matter. And also, although we haven't had many malingering people, we've learned how to work with that too. So next slide, please. I'd like to talk a little bit about the interviews because we've learned that doing these asylum interviews is very nuanced. Rather than just giving a list of symptoms and writing an affidavit that says, oh, they have these PTSD symptoms, they have these depressive symptoms, etc., we really train our students to learn that this is a person with a diagnosis. We found that in court, if you just present a diagnosis, you have a much less chance of getting a grant of an asylum, than if you present a person with a diagnosis. The judge, and also we as psychologists, like to know who this is. So we ask questions like, tell me about life in whatever country you were coming from before you left. We focus on the major traumas experienced in the immigration and before the immigration. We don't just want to know what happened, but we want to know what it was like being pistol whipped by the gangs, by the gangs in Honduras. We want to know what it was like being in Nigeria and being threatened with female genital mutilation. We want to know what it was like being a gay person in Russia, where it's banned to be a gay person in Russia. And, we tell our students, we don't want to be watching the movie. We want to be in the movie. We want to see it and feel it the way the person who is seeking asylum saw it and felt it. And this is a real skill. And of course, the last and really not the longest part of the interview is indeed we do come up with a diagnosis. We have our students sit with the DSM and go through the symptoms of PTSD, depression, whatever, so that we can indeed present the judge with a diagnosis. But we really want to present a person. And one of the things that we found is that we tell our students, contrary to the rest of their training, especially in psychodynamic psychotherapy, we avoid open-ended questions. What was it like growing up in Guatemala? Well, it was good. Well, that doesn't get us anywhere, now does it? So tell me about your town. Tell me who lived in your town. Tell me about home. Tell me about what happened when your father came home drunk, etc. We need to really focus and find out what it was like to experience some of the things that we read about in the affidavits. And that indeed is a major portion of the interview. So now, next slide, please, Carl. Now I'm going to tell you in closing about some of our challenges and about some of our triumphs. And then I'll turn it over to Carl to talk about some of the research that we've done. The challenges, well, the logistics of this class is unlike any other graduate class. The students' grades are really based on their doing an affidavit. And they have to write an affidavit, and that's what they do as part of as their work for the class. They do the interviews and write the affidavits. No papers, no finals, no anything. And we tell them on the outset that legal deadlines circumvent academic deadlines. If you have a final exam on a day that an affidavit is due, you take the final exam on another day, and that's just all there is to it. And we also tell them that much of the work, contacting lawyers, etc., working with translators, happens outside of class hours. And we find that the students develop a different picture of the world that they live in. They can't believe what goes on in other countries. Of course, I couldn't believe what goes on in other countries when I first got into this work either. And our students learn that life in the United States is really the land of the free and the land of the privileged. There is no freedom like we have in the United States in Peru if you're a transgender person. There's no freedom if you're about to have female genital mutilation in Nigeria. And so they start to think differently about the people in their everyday lives. They think about they start to wonder who the Honduran landscaper is, the Mexican cleaning person, the Chinese restaurant worker. And these people start to have real lives and challenges for them. And of course, the clinical work, as I've alluded to, is not like the therapy or assessment that gets taught in other classes. Students really need to learn to get to the heart of the matter, meaning the psychiatric symptoms and the trauma, quickly within a 2-hour interview. There's no psychotherapy process to get to it. Students learn different meanings to being supportive and nice. We tell our asylum seekers, we tell our students to tell our asylum seekers, this will hurt. These interviews are not comfortable. We're going to rather learn from you about things in your life that you would rather not tell us about, things that you put in the dark recesses of your mind. But we need to hear about that because it helps their case. It's going to make their case for them. And of course, it's a unique type of supervision that Carl and I offer. We will text to the students, get to it. I want to hear what happened in the jail cell now when you were being raped by the guards, etc. And of course, that doesn't happen in other settings, other classes. That's not the way supervision usually is. Next slide, please, Carl. So some of the challenges: students learn that other disciplines do not think like psychologists. Lawyers are interested in facts rather than feelings, and we have to educate the lawyers that we work with on how we evaluate asylum seekers. And sometimes we invite lawyers to join us in the room watching the interviews. Judges believe that the sicker you look, the more likely you are to get asylum. So we have to tell our students that we really want to go for the pathology here. This is not about making everything okay. And that, of course, brings up a lot of anger because, as I said before, students have never faced the type of injustices that they see in this class. I mean, it's not in the normal course of life that we hear that, I'm thinking of an African client that we had where he was asked to, at gunpoint, he was asked to sodomize his best friend or he would be killed. It's not the kind of thing you come in contact with every day. And so this type of social injustice is hard to hear about, and it stirs up difficult internal feelings, mostly anger, quite understandably. And although we talk about the anger and we process the anger is still there and it's legitimate. And it often becomes displaced onto the course, the instructors, the graduate program, the government, whatever. And so we really are challenged to focus on helping our students process this anger. And that's our job. We have to make the anger real because it comes out covertly so often. We tell, just like our students tell the asylum seekers, this will hurt. We tell our students, you will be upset. You will be angry. We talk about that. But the last thing I'm going to say to you all, next slide, please, Carl, is that with all of this comes triumph. We've had every case that has gone to court that we know about has gotten asylum over the last 5 years. We also have a 100% student internal change rate. Students see the world differently after taking our class, and they never forget it. It's a learning experience that none of our students will ever forget. And of course, as a professor, teaching this class has been one of the most unique and unforgettable academic experiences that I've had. And out of the class, we recently, in the last couple of years, 3 years, had a number of opportunities to do qualitative research, and that's what Carl will talk about now in the rest of this webinar. Thanks for listening.
Okay, thank you, Bill. I'm going to take over where Bill left off and talk about the qualitative research that we have done. Before I get to the research issues, however, I want to just say a few things about our approach to research and the context in which we do research. Several things about the context. First of all, we are in a graduate training program, so students have to do research. So that's part of our researchers are the students who have to do something. As you all know, there's a lot of pressure these days for research to be quantitative, hypothesis testing, evidence-based. We, of course, have no arguments that there should be evidence and that research should be done. However, on the basis of what we're doing, we've developed some different attitudes about research in this area in particular, which is research involves hypothesizing relationships between independent and dependent variables where you have some reason to guess what the relationships are. This doesn't quite work here because the populations are very different, often from different countries or different professions or different walks of life or something. So we're not really in a position to kind of state reasonable hypotheses, let alone quantify anything. So that has led us to do qualitative research on the whole system of which we are a part. And that's what I'm going to turn to now, the research issues that we have examined. We've become aware as we're doing this work that there are a lot of populations who are involved in the whole asylum seekers process. And we're interested in all of them. First of all, we're interested in the asylum seekers themselves. What are their characteristics? What are they like? What experiences do they have, etc. Second of all, we're interested in the legal professionals that work with the asylum seekers. We're interested in particular in how working with asylum seekers affects the professionals other than the students who actually do the testing. We've worked with a lot of law students and lawyers, so we've done some research on their experience. And finally, of course, we're interested in the students that we're training. So we've done research on how they perceive the asylum seekers course in general and as part of their professional training, and how it contributed both to their personal and professional development. For all the reasons that I stated, this doesn't lend itself to any hypothesis testing. So instead, we are doing qualitative research, which I'm now going to characterize in general. First of all, we do grounded theory research. That is, we interview people, read the transcripts of what they tell us on the basis of their interviews, and then build theory on the basis of what they have told us. It's called grounded theory because the theory is grounded in the textual reports of their experience. I do teach a course in qualitative research, but this is not the place to give you even a summary. I just want to sort of outline our major goal. And our major goal is to elicit people's stories and tell those stories in a way that gives an account of both their subjective experience, but also puts their subjective experience in the context of psychological theory. So we do a structured reading, and I'm now just going to kind of tell you some of the words. We start off with having students underline relevant text in which they find ideas. Those ideas are organized into themes, and those themes in turn lead us to theoretical constructs, which lead us to a theoretical narrative, which is their story. That's clearly too brief, but I just wanted to let you know that we're working from the ground up. I want to say a little bit more now about the qualitative research process, because that's relevant to what I'll be telling you. There is a key idea about qualitative research, which sounds like sort of totally obvious until you've had graduate research training, in which case it sounds either radical or eccentric. The idea is that you can learn a great deal about psychological processes by asking people questions about their experience and listening to and making sense of their answers. That is to say, quantitative research involves numbers. Qualitative research involves hearing people's stories and making sense of them. We've used a grounded theory methodology. Here's a mildly shameless bit of self-promotion that my colleague Louise and Silverstein and I have developed, and there's a reference if you're interested in it. So let me talk now about the first area that we've investigated. Sorry, the asylum seeker's journey. This is based on interviews with asylum seekers from all sorts of countries, both the Central American countries that we study and also Asia and Eastern Europe as well. The student who conducted this research was David Gordon. He had like kind of an object relational interpersonal background. So he formulated his theoretical narrative in terms of those variables. But it makes perfect sense as you'll hear. First of all, in talking about the story, the asylum seeker story, he talked about an initial sense of dislocation that people have, and this is important in understanding the people you interview, as we'll see. They lost their relational context. Here's one person talking about that. They said it was very difficult in the beginning. They had no friends, no nothing. It was difficult. I didn't have anyone. Then, but after they did flee the country of origin, that they had this kind of terrible experience, which we've heard people talk about as well, that their life was put on hold. You can read the text here. They didn't know their status. They were in limbo. It's like 2.5 years of not knowing anything. And then, at least for some of them, they found that they had to reconstruct their sense of self, their agency in a new relational world. Here I'm going to, again, just sort of summarize the quote, that if they feel sad and pain, there's someone you can go to. Maybe the person can't even do anything, but knowing that someone is there is nice. Clearly, I mean, this is an extensive study, but I just wanted to give you the picture. And having given you the picture, I want to talk about what I think is important for this in terms of our work with asylum seekers. First of all, although in fact, as Bill said, we need to provide a diagnosis to make the asylum seeker experience plausible, in actually thinking about the asylum seekers, interviewing them, and sort of dealing with thinking about treatment and intervention, I think you have to think beyond PTSD and think beyond diagnosis in general. People have to be helped to cope with the loss of an old life and constructing a new one. Another important thing to keep in mind is that these people are not victims, or certainly not simply victims. In order to leave in the first place and survive this kind of terrible dislocation and relocation, which I've talked about, there's a high level of resilience, and that has to be respected as well. We do that in our interviews. In terms of treatment, this is now my suggestion that because of the relational issues involved in constructing a new life, we think that group therapy would be a valuable part of a asylum seekers program, particularly during and after the asylum grant. The next population that we began to investigate is in general how working with asylum seekers affects law students both positively and negatively. This is research conducted by one of our graduate students, Tim Miller. And the story that I'm going to tell you is about law students in particular, but I think it's relevant to this work in general, but of course, particularly for people working with lawyers. What the law students told us is they felt vulnerable and unprepared for the work with asylum seekers that in preparing their legal affidavits that they ended up doing. They felt gaps in their training and gaps in their legal socialization. Here's one person talking about it. I'm going to kind of summarize what he said. he talked about being so busy with other things as a law student that he didn't have time to process feelings. He needed to compartmentalize, and etc. And then what he said, and sorry, many of our students say that as well. They said that there was a change in their worldview, and they had to make meaning, that the work enriched them in some way. One man said, for example, I think in a way it's made me feel in the world like I live in is so small compared to everything that's going on out there. And then they talked also about a sense of unsustainability and burnout. And I want to stress here that this is both the positive and the negative of the work that they do. The positive is that it enhances their sense of what the world is like, but it's too intense. They feel like they can't deal with it, or they haven't been prepared to deal with it, and they don't feel certainly that they can sustain it. I think these results too have important implications for training, and Bill and I have been thinking about this. We think that professionals working with asylum seekers need some sort of psychoeducation. It's been sort of our shock to realize that although people have heard about PTSD and trauma, they kind of really don't know too much about it. So we think it's important to educate them about trauma. And we also think it's important to educate people about what we in the field call secondary traumatization, and to take it seriously. A suggestion that we have, which we think somebody should set up, although we haven't been as yet asked to do it, but we think the people who do this incredibly trying work should have some support groups to both normalize their experiences and help them integrate their experiences with their prior legal identity. I want to move now to the third population that Bill and I have had students investigated, which is we're studying our course itself. This sounds like a radical idea that not only should you study other people, but you should other programs, but you should also study yourself. And we've found it really very helpful. I'm going to tell you some of the things that we're finding. This is ongoing research conducted by two of our graduate students, Hannah Goose and Megan McGinn. Very interesting things. Bill alluded to it, but it's interesting to hear people actually say it. First of all, the students really talked about how the asylum seekers course is an outlet for their social justice concerns. You can read the quote here, but one student really just say that, and this is one among many, that the student really came into psychology with an interest in social justice and was very glad that there was an opportunity that they could get it. On the same line, taking our course gave them like a broader view of what the profession is about. You can read the quote here, but basically what people began to feel is that they were struggling with what they could do as psychologists. How can they do something besides individual patients, not just one-on-one psychotherapy? And the course gave them a sense that psychology and the work of psychologists went beyond the consulting room. And in addition to that, I think the course enriched their sense of themselves as citizens, which I'll talk about in a minute. They learned that, as Bill said as well, that there's a big world out there other than the Bronx and the Upper West Side, where our students go to school. There's a world of asylum seekers, for example, of which people knew nothing until they took the course. And that raised important issues for them. Like one student said, for example, what does it mean to be an alien, to be out of place? And of course, what does it feel like? So it's really a lot like a kind of education for people. And I think that has important implications, which I sort of allude to briefly. First of all, there's a tendency, I think, in our graduate program, but I think in many graduate programs, to think that the function of training is to develop skills and competencies. and who can be against competency and skill. But I think there's more. And I think clinical education, at least for the people who want it, should help psychologists develop as citizens, capable of giving something to society at large besides treating individual patients. And that's worth keeping in mind. And I think, too, one of the things that I learned, you know, teaching the course is that all of our students really had social justice concerns. That's one of the reasons they entered into the field. And to some extent, they're asked to put them on hold. So the course of this sort gives people a way to not put them on hold. And I think this basic idea should be kept in mind and even replicated elsewhere. And finally, the other thing that we have learned is we've learned that all of this is like very collaborative teamwork. Students, professionals from law, psychology, medicine are all kind of working together. And Bill and I both have a feeling that it would be a good idea if this shouldn't be just sort of unofficial and by chance, but rather there could be some sort of course or seminar, something along those lines, where transdisciplinary things actually happen officially. And finally, I want to talk about one of Bill's and my experiences. I call it team building in Dilley, Texas and beyond. This has been the stuff of at least our personal legend. What we found, well, actually the event is that in 2015, Bill and I, along with two of our graduate students, went to Dilley, Texas, which is one of the detention centers, and to prepare psychological affidavits. And something really important happened for us there, which is we began to develop like a sense of, community, that we are, all of us, besides professors and students, we are people working together for a common purpose, and that was part of our educational objective. It was an informative experience for us, and a formative experience for them as well. I'll just give you one story. When Bill and I first went to the detention center, we had to check our cell phones and our earbuds, and we were asked why we did it, and they said, well, those critters there are pretty dangerous, and they might grab your earbuds and hang themselves with it. That was an attitude that we saw, and we got, I think, a real sense of what people have called like the prison industrial complex. And again, that's a reality which it's important for students to know about. More generally, I think, this is not like a student party where we go to like meet and greet and talk about our hobbies. I think, as Bill said too, we developed like a team mentality in our asylum classes, in our work. And I think this team mentality, students and faculty working together to develop a professional identity, is an important experience that we have had and created, and important to keep in mind in thinking about a course of this sort. And with that, I'll stop. Okay.
Thank you so much. This is Sarah Mancall again, and we have some time for questions and answers. So if you are on the webinar and you have a question for our presenters, please type it into the chat box, and I can read it to our presenters. I had one question to just kick things off. So I am affiliated with Division 9 of APA, and we have some members who are in the clinical world, but we also have a lot of members who are not in the clinical world. So these kind of opportunities, are they just open to psychologists who are in the clinical space, or if a social psychologist who's interested in this work, can they also get involved?
I actually, since I was talking, I'll just answer first, although I think Bill has a opinion. My feeling is we want as many people involved as possible, that there's a lot of perspectives and they're all useful.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I'll just tell you a story about that. I got a call from one of our board members at Furkhouse, who is not a psychologist, and she said, "Look, I'm really concerned about what's going on in the detention centers, and I want to go down there." And I mean, she's not even a psychologist, and we did some research together on what she could do, and it's like this is a troubled population. This is I don't need to speak about what the government's attitudes are towards asylum seekers. People can go down to Dili and find a way to get security clearance and just go into the detention centers and play with the kids, you know, and give the mothers some relief. Uh, there is so much work to be done that I think getting involved should be quite easy and very important.
I am going to wait and see if we get any more questions. But to follow up on that, um, I have a question. How do asylum seekers get referred to your clinic or referred to what you and your students and colleagues are doing?
Well, look, like everything else, certainly we have a connection with PHR, Physicians for Human Rights, and every month they put out a list of people who are seeking asylum whom they have vetted and whose law firms they have vetted. And so we often get people off that list. But more importantly than that, people get referred to us because we've done some work either for their law firm or for someone in their family or for someone in their clinic, and people hear about us. And just like a general mental health clinic, the best referrals come from satisfied customers, and we're building that network. And so we have many firms and clinics and organizations that refer to us because we've worked with them in the past, and they've liked the outcome. So that's the refer. There's no dearth of referrals by any means.
Yeah, I want to add something to that, which is that sometimes we think about this asylum work as work that we do or work that our clinic or our program does, but I think of it more and more as like work that a whole network does, and we really get referrals because we are part of a network that trusts us and whom we trust.
Yeah, that's true.
I don't see any other questions coming in.
We must have covered everything.
I know, everyone is speechless. I guess I have one final question, which is if someone is not in New York City, whatever city or town they're in, and they want to get involved in this kind of work, how do they go about finding an organization like your own that's doing this kind of work?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
I think that, look, I thank God for the internet. I think that if you're in Seattle or St. Louis or wherever, I think that the first step would be to just Google immigration or immigration law firms or public service immigration law firms, and then start speaking to them. And I'll say something about that because Carl and I have encountered this, and there have been articles written about this. There's a lot of, well, dare I say, crime in this work. There are a lot of law firms that sort of pretend to be helping asylum seekers, but really they're out to take asylum seekers' money and do very little else. The New York Times covered a law firm in Chinatown that was eventually, the FBI found them and they shut them down. But my advice is to people, really vet their sources before they start referring to them, because excuse me, there's no regulation in this business. There's no OMH or APA or anything like that, So you really have to know that the people who say they're helping you are legitimate.
Yeah, one other thing, actually. Division 56 for a time was setting up a referral network for people who wanted services. I was involved for a time, but no longer. It was Division 56, and I think Elizabeth Carl, Carll, was involved, so they could Google that as well. If you want to get involved, I think with a little research, somebody will want you.
Well, thank you so much. I think we have all of the questions answered. That last one was actually from a grad student in Chicago who's training and asked about programs in different parts of the country. So thank you so much to our presenters. I am going to upload this webinar to SPICY's YouTube page, and I'll send around the link once that's up. And with the presenters' permission, I'll also share a copy of your slides. And stay tuned, because we're going to have a number of immigration and refugee asylum seeker themed webinars over the next several months with different speakers from different APA divisions. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
Bye, everyone.
We'll hang up. Okay.